Welcome to Rad on Smart Review, the RadBio edition.
Glad to be here.
So imagine you're planning, say, a head and neck case. Tumors right near the spinal cord.
Yep, classic scenario.
Or maybe it's prostate and you're deciding between SBRT, big fractions,
Right.
versus a more standard, longer course.
Right. How do you choose? How do you balance hitting the tumor hard with sparing that critical normal tissue?
Exactly. And it all comes down to how you fractionate the dose, how you split it up. But how do we actually quantify that? How do we predict which schedule is better for the tumor versus the normal tissue?
Well, that's precisely what we're digging into today. It's really about the core radiobiology, the math, and the concepts behind how different tissues respond to different fractionation schemes.
It's absolutely fundamental stuff you use every day, really.
It is. So we're going to revisit the Linear-Quadratic model, or LQ model.
And really get into the alpha-beta ratio.
Definitely. Then calculating biological effective dose, BED, and the equivalent dose in two gray fractions, EQD2.
And we'll look at Isoeffect curves, too, how they visualize all this.
Plus, importantly, why it matters clinically and, where the models maybe fall a bit short.
Think of this as a focused tutoring session. We want you to really nail these concepts, not just for your exams, but for making smart clinical choices.
Absolutely. Ready to jump in? Where do we start with quantifying cell kill?
Okay, let's start with the model everyone uses, the workhorse model for describing cell survival after radiation, especially the kind we use clinically, like X-rays. Low LET radiation.
You mean the linear-quadratic model, the LQ model?
That's the one. It describes the surviving fraction of cells, S, after dose D.
Right. The formula is S equals E raised to the power of minus, then in parentheses, alpha D plus beta D squared.
Yeah, and I always find it a bit easier to think about the effect, the log cell kill.
Ah, okay. So minus the natural log of S.
Exactly. And that equals alpha times D plus beta times D squared. Writing it that way makes it really clear there are two parts to the killing.
Yes. The linear part, alpha D, and the quadratic part, beta D squared. Let's tackle that alpha component first. What's the biology behind that?
The alpha term, that's cell killing. That's just directly proportional to the dose. Think like single hit killing.
Exactly. It's thought to be from one radiation track causing lethal DNA damage that the cell just can't repair.
Like a single track causing two double-strand breaks really close together, leading to something bad like a decentric.
That's the classic idea. And because it's a single event, it dominates the cell killing when you use low doses per fraction.
And it doesn't really depend on the dose rate, right? Because it happens immediately.
Correct. Generally considered dose rate independent. Single track, non-repairable, dominant at low doses.
Got it. Okay, so what about the beta component, the beta D squared term?
That's different. It's proportional to the dose squared. This suggests it needs, interaction.
Interaction, like from two separate events.
Precisely. Either damage from two separate radiation tracks interacting, or maybe two independent sublethal lesions accumulating and then combining to become lethal.
Like two different electron tracks each cause a single break, and then those breaks find each other later.
That's the concept. And because it requires that interaction or accumulation, it implies that the initial damage might be repairable.
So if you give the cell enough time between hits, it might fix the first bit of damage before the second one happens.
Exactly. Which means this beta component becomes much more important at higher doses per fraction.
Because you're causing more damage quickly, increasing the chance of those interactions before repair can happen.
Right. And unlike the alpha component, this beta killing is dose rate dependent. If you deliver the dose slowly, you allow more time for that sublethal damage repair.
So biologically, it boils down to lethal chromosome breaks. Alpha from single tracks, beta from interacting breaks from multiple tracks.
That's the simplified picture, yeah. But it works remarkably well for explaining dose response. And this difference between alpha and beta damage is absolutely critical for understanding the alpha-beta ratio.
Okay, the alpha-beta ratio. This is where things get really interesting for comparing tissues. What's the formal definition?
It's defined as the dose, D, where the linear component of cell killing, alpha times D, is exactly equal to the quadratic component, beta times D squared.
So mathematically, alpha D equals beta D squared.
Yeah.
You divide by D and beta.
Yeah.
And you get D equals alpha divided by beta. That dose is the alpha-beta ratio.
Correct. It's that specific dose point where the single-hit, non-repairable killing mechanism contributes just as much to the overall effect as the two-hit, potentially repairable mechanism.
And the units are just dose units, so gray.
Yep, typically gray.
Okay, so why is this ratio so important clinically? What does it tell us?
It's a really crucial measure of how sensitive a tissue or a tumor is to changes in the dose per fraction. It basically describes the curviness or the shoulder on the survival curve.
Let's talk about a low alpha-beta ratio first. What kind of tissues have that?
Low alpha beta ratios are usually in the range of, say, 1 to 5 gray,
Hmm.
often cited as around 2 or 3 gray for many important
And
tissues.
which tissues are those?
These are characteristic of your late responding normal tissues. Think spinal cord, lung, kidney, bladder, connective tissue, the ones where damage shows up months or years later.
And their survival curves. You said curvy.
Very curvy, a prominent shoulder. This implies they rely heavily on repairing that beta type sublethal damage.
Which means?
It means they are highly sensitive to fraction size. If you increase the dose per fraction, you overwhelm that repair capacity much more easily.
So big fractions are bad for these tissues.
Disproportionately bad, yes. But using lots of small fractions, like in hyperfractionation, spares them significantly because they get more chance to repair between fractions.
Okay, low alpha-beta, curvy curve, sensitive to fraction size, characteristic of late tissues. Now, high alpha-beta ratio.
High alpha-beta ratios are typically higher, maybe 7 to 20 gray, but often centered around 10 grays as a useful benchmark.
And these are?
These are typical for early responding normal tissues, skin, gut mucosa, bone marrow, the tissues that react during or shortly after treatment. And importantly, most tumors also fall into this high alpha-beta category.
So their curves are less curvy, more straight.
Exactly. More linear, less of a shoulder. This means the alpha component, the direct single-hit killing, is more dominant across a wider range of doses compared to the beta component.
Meaning they're less bothered by changes in fraction size.
Less sensitive, yes, compared to the late tissues. Their response depends more on the total dose delivered rather than precisely how it's fractionated.
Wow. So the difference between an alpha-beta of maybe 3 for the cord and 10 for the tumor, that's the whole game, radiobiologically speaking.
That's the entire basis for altered fractionation. That difference in sensitivity to fraction size, that difference in the shape of the survival curve, is what we exploit clinically.
Which naturally leads us to how we actually compare different schedules. Let's talk biological effective dose, BED.
Right. BED is a way to put a number on the biological punch delivered by a specific fractionation schedule to a specific tissue. It lets us compare apples and oranges, biologically speaking.
So it accounts for the total physical dose, the dose per fraction, and critically, that tissue's own alpha-beta ratio.
Precisely. The formula you absolutely need to know is BED equals N times D, which is total dose.
Contimes, in parentheses, 1 plus D divided by the alpha-beta ratio.
Exactly. N is number fractions, D is dose per fraction, and that alpha-beta ratio you plug in depends entirely on the tissue you're interested in.
Yeah, and the units are gray, but we always specify which alpha-beta was used,
Yeah.
like BED10 or BD3.
Or gray 10, gray 3, yes, you have to specify the context.
But what's the main use of BED?
Primarily, it's for calculating isoeffective doses. If you have a standard treatment schedule and you want to switch to, say, a hypofractionated schedule, you use BED to figure out what total dose in the new schedule will give the same biological effect to the tissue you care about, whether that's the tumor or critical normal structure.
So schedules with the same DED for a given tissue are considered biologically equivalent for that tissue.
Correct. For example, you could calculate the BED10 for your tumor for 2 different schedules to see if they pack the same punch against the cancer.
But you'd also need to calculate the BED3 for the nearby spinal cord for both schedules to see which one is gentler on the cord.
Exactly. You have to run the calculation for each tissue of interest using its own alpha-beta ratio. And a quick caveat, the basic BED formula doesn't explicitly factor in time, like tumor repopulation during treatment. That's a limitation to keep in mind.
Okay, so BED gives us this biological effect number, but sometimes it's helpful to translate that back into a more familiar currency, like a standard dose.
Right. That's where EQD2 comes in, equivalent dose in 2 gray fractions.
Why 2 gray fractions?
Because 2 grays per fraction has been the historical standard for conventional radiotherapy for so long. EQD2 takes the calculated BED for any schedule and tells you what total physical dose, if delivered in 2 gray fractions, would produce that exact same biological effect.
So it lets you compare, say, an SBRT schedule directly to a conventional schedule in terms we understand intuitively.
Precisely. It standardizes everything back to that 2 gray per fraction benchmark.
How do you calculate it? Is it complicated?
Not really. It builds right off BED. First, you calculate the BED for the schedule you're interested in, using the appropriate alpha-beta ratio.
Okay, got the BED. Then what?
Then you basically rearrange the BED formula. You say, okay, this BED value must equal the BD of a hypothetical schedule given in 2 gray fractions. And you solve for the total dose of that hypothetical schedule.
Which gives the formula. EQD2 equals the BDD you just calculated, divided by.
Divided by, in parentheses, 1 plus 2 divided by the alpha-beta ratio. The 2 there represents the 2 gray fraction size you're converting to.
Makes sense. BED divided by the biological effect factor for a 2 gray fraction.
That's a good way to think about it. It's incredibly useful for comparing any schedule back to known conventional dose tolerance limits for normal tissues, which are often expressed in EQD2.
These concepts become even clearer visually with isoeffect curves. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. Isoeffect curves are graphs that show you all the different combinations of total dose and dose per fraction that result in the same level of biological effect for a specific tissue.
Usually plotted with total dose on the vertical y-axis and dose per fraction on the horizontal x-axis.
Correct. And as you move along the curve to the left towards smaller doses per fraction.
The curve goes up, you need a higher total dose.
Right, because with smaller fractions, the tissue has more opportunity to repair sublethal damage between fractions, so you need to give more total dose overall to achieve the same amount of cell kill.
And the key thing is the steepness of these curves, right?
Yeah.
How quickly they rise as fraction size decreases.
Absolutely. That steepness tells you everything about fraction size sensitivity, and it links directly back to the alpha-beta ratio.
So late responding tissues, the ones with low alpha-beta ratios like 2 or 3 gray,
They have very steep isoeffect curves.
meaning even a small change in dose per fraction requires a huge change in total dose to maintain the same biological effect. They're super sensitive to fraction size.
Exactly. While early responding tissues and most tumors, with their high alpha-beta ratios around 10 gray,
Their curves are shallower, flatter.
right, the total dose needed changes much less dramatically when you alter the fraction size. They're less sensitive to fractionation changes.
You see those classic plots, like from Withers and Thames, showing the steep curves for things like spinal cord and kidney, and the shallower curves for skin reactions or tumors.
Those figures really drive the point home. That difference in steepness is the therapeutic window we try to exploit with altered fractionation.
Like using hyperfractionation, small fractions that climb up the shallow tumor curve while staying relatively lower on the steep late effect curve.
Precisely. You spare the late tissues more effectively for a given tumor effect. Conversely, using hypofractionation, large fractions, means you slide down both curves, but you slide down the steep late effect curve much more dramatically, increasing the biological dose to those critical tissues.
Which brings us right into clinical decision-making. These concepts aren't just theory, they are literally how we design treatments.
Every single day. When we choose conventional fractionation or hyperfractionation, we are making a calculated bet based on the assumed alpha-beta ratios of the tumor and the nearby normal tissues.
Let's take hyperfractionation. Bigger dose per fraction, fewer fractions.
Okay, you're giving a bigger quadratic hit with each fraction because d squared is larger. For a tumor with a high alpha-beta around 10, the increase in effect might be moderate.
But for the late responding normal tissue nearby, with its low alpha-beta around 3,
That bigger d in the over alpha-beta part of the BD formula has a much larger impact. The BD delivered to that late tissue goes up significantly more than the BD to the tumor, relatively speaking.
so you might gain convenience or maybe some tumor control benefit in specific situations, but you're accepting a higher biological dose and thus higher risk to those critical late responding organs.
That's the trade-off. Now, flip it. Hyperfractionation. Smaller dose per fraction, often twice a day to keep the overall time reasonable.
Here, D is smaller.
Right. So the 8 over alpha-beta term becomes less significant, especially for the low alpha-beta late tissues.
So for the tumor, high alpha-beta, the effect might be maintained or even increased by delivering a higher total dose over the course.
But for the late tissues, low alpha-beta, that small at a d significantly reduces the biological impact per fraction compared to conventional 2 gray fractions.
Meaning you could potentially escalate the total dose to the tumor for better control, while actually decreasing the BED to the critical late structures.
That's the goal, yes. It potentially improves the therapeutic ratio by sparing late effects.
And EQD2 calculations are vital here for practical application.
Absolutely. We constantly use EQD2 to convert doses from, say, an SBRT plan back to a 2 gray equivalent to check against known tolerance limits for the spinal cord, optic nerves, brainstem, etc. It's a safety check.
It really all comes down to optimizing that therapeutic ratio, maximizing tumor kill, minimizing normal tissue damage. These concepts guide our choices on fraction size, total dose, everything.
They are absolutely central.
Okay, fantastic. Let's shift gears and crystallize some clinical pearls. The absolute must-know points for exams and practice.
Sounds good. Pearl number 1.
The LQ model log cell kill formula minus natural log of S equals alpha D plus beta D squared. Know those two components.
Pearl number 2, the alpha-beta ratio. It's the dose where alpha D equals beta D squared. Remember the key values. Approximately 10 grays for tumors and early effects, and around 2 to 3 gray for late effects. Burn those into your memory.
Pearl number 3, biological effective dose, BED. It quantifies the biological effect. Know the formula. N times D times 1 plus D alpha beta. Understand what N, D, and alpha beta mean.
Pearl number 4, equivalent dose in 2 gray fractions, EQD2. It converts any schedule's BED back to an equivalent total dose in 2 gray fractions. Formula is BED, 1 plus 2 alpha beta. Essential for comparisons.
And pearl number 5, isoeffect curves. Late responding tissues, low alpha beta, have steeper curves than early responding tissue tumors, high alpha beta. This means late effects are much, much more sensitive to fraction size changes.
Nail those 5 points, and you've got the core mechanics down.
Definitely. Now, we've praised the LQ model, but we also need to be realistic about its limitations and controversies. It's not perfect.
No model is. First off, it's mechanistic basis. It's more descriptive, phenomenological. It fits the data pretty well in many situations, but it's a simplification of complex biology.
And it kind of assumes everything uniform, right? Like
Yeah.
all cells in a tumor respond the same way.
Which we know isn't true. Tumors are messy, different oxygen levels, different proliferation rates. Plus, the basic model doesn't really account for things like bystander effects or the tissue microenvironment.
There's also debate about how well it works at very high doses per fraction, like in SBRT or radiosurgery. Does the curve keep bending, or does it straighten out?
Yeah, doses above, say, 8 or 10 grays per fraction. Other cell death mechanisms might play a bigger role, and the simple LQ formula might not fully capture the reality. It's an active area of research and debate.
And also at the other extreme, very low doses.
Sometimes you see deviations there too, like low-dose hyperradiosensitivity or adaptive responses that the standard LQ model doesn't predict.
And probably the biggest practical limitation is time, right? The basic model doesn't include repair times or tumor repopulation.
Exactly. Especially for treatments that take many wicks, tumor cells growing back during treatment is a huge factor, and the simple BED formula doesn't account for that. There are more complex models that try to add time factors, but they get, well, more complex.
So, lots of caveats. But despite all that,
it remains the most useful, most clinically applied tool we have for understanding and comparing fractionation schedules. It gives us a common language and framework.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, ready for a quick board review blitz. Let's test your recall.
Let's do it. Fire away.
Question 1. In the linear-quadratic model, the alpha component represents cell killing, that is. A, proportional to dose squared and repairable. B, proportional to dose squared and non-repairable. C, proportional to dose and repairable. D, proportional to dose and non-repairable.
Okay, alpha component. That's the linear part, alpha D. It's proportional to dose, and it's a non-repairable single-track damage, so that's D.
Correct. D, proportional to dose and non-repairable. Question 2. A tissue has an alpha-beta ratio of 3 gray. This means that at a dose of 3 gray, A, 37% of the cells survive. B, the linear component of cell killing is 3 times the quadratic component. C, the quadratic component of cell killing is 3 times the linear component. D, the linear and quadratic components of cell killing are equal.
The definition of the alpha-beta ratio is the dose where the linear alpha D and quadratic beta D squared components of killing are equal. So if the alpha-beta ratio is 3 gray, then at 3 gray, those two components are equal. Answer is D.
Exactly.
D.
The linear and quadratic components of cell killing are equal. Question 3. Which of the following tissues typically has the lowest alpha-beta ratio, making it most sensitive to changes in dose per fraction? A, skin for acute reaction. B, tumor, e.g. squamous cell carcinoma. C, gastrointestinal mucosa. D, spinal cord.
Lowest alpha-beta means late responding tissue, most sensitive to fraction size. Looking at the options, skin acute is early, tumor is usually early, high alpha-beta, GI mucosa is early. Spinal cord is the classic late responding tissue with a low alpha-beta, so D, spinal cord.
Perfect. D, spinal cord, typically around 2-3 gray. Okay, last one, a calculation. Get ready. Question 4. A radiation treatment is delivered as 20 fractions of 3 grays each. For a late-responding tissue with an alpha-beta ratio of 3 gray, what is the biological effective dose? BED,
Yeah.
A60 gray 3, B80 gray 3, C100 gray 3, D120 gray 3.
Okay, calculation time. BED equals ND, 1 plus D alpha beta. Here, N plus 3 gray alpha beta tau 3 3. Total dose ND is 60 gray. Plug into the formula. BED equals 60, 1 plus 3, 3. So 3 divided by 3 is 1. The part in parentheses is 1 plus 1, which is 2. So BED equals 62.
Which equals?
120. So 120 gray 3. That's answer D.
Excellent. D is correct. You see how crucial knowing that formula and the typical alpha-beta values is? You'll absolutely do calculations like that.
No doubt about it. It's fundamental.
So let's just quickly summarize what we covered. We really dug into the core concepts of fractionation.
Yeah, we started with the LQ model, the alpha and beta components of cell kill.
And then the all-important alpha-beta ratio, the measure of fraction size sensitivity, remember about 10 gray for tumorous early effects, and 2 to 3 gray for late effects.
We covered how to calculate BED to quantify biological effect, and EQD2 to compare schedules back to a 2 gray standard.
And we looked at isoeffect curves, seeing visually how late tissues, low alpha beta, have those steep curves, making them super sensitive to fraction size, unlike the shallower curves for tumors and early tissues.
And we acknowledged the LQ model's limitations, but stressed it's still our best clinical framework for thinking about this.
Absolutely. It's the foundation.
It really is.
And that leads perfectly into our final thought. Really understanding these concepts, BED, EQD2, alpha beta, it isn't just about passing exams. It's about truly understanding why we choose the fractionation schedules we do. It lets you appreciate the power you have when you change the dose per fraction and how that single change can dramatically shift the balance between controlling the tumor and protecting critical normal tissues like the spinal cord or the lung. Maximizing that therapeutic ratio, that's the art and science of what we do.
Well said. It gives us the tools to practice safely and effectively.
Practice more questions and concepts at radonsmartlearn.com. And make sure you subscribe to Radon Smart Review for our next session. Thanks so much for tuning in.